The morning Lucy Covington buried her father, Sheriff Dale Haggerty stood at the edge of the grave and told her, loud enough for the whole town of Redrock Flats to hear, that she ought to start thinking about selling the land before the season turned. The sky above the Texas panhandle was the color of old pewter that September of 1882, and the wind pulled at the black ribbon on Lucy's hat with the kind of persistence she had come to associate with men who believed they knew better than she did. She stood at the head of the grave with her hands folded in front of her jaw set in a line that her father had always called her mother's line, and she did not look at the sheriff when he spoke. She looked at the pine box being lowered into the earth, and she made a private promise to the man inside it. She would not sell. Gerald Covington had built the Double C Ranch with his own hands and the help of one hired man over the course of 15 years. He had broken the soil when it resisted and nursed cattle through 2 droughts and a fever that had swept through the herd in the summer of 1878. He had done all of it after Lucy's mother, Clara, died of a lung sickness when Lucy was 9 years old, and he had raised his daughter on that land with the quiet certainty that she would inherit not just the acres and the cattle but the understanding of how to tend them. Lucy was 24 years old and she had been working that ranch alongside her father since she was old enough to hold a bucket. Sheriff Dale Haggerty was 43, thick through the middle, and had been the law in Redrock Flats for 11 years. He was not a cruel man in the obvious sense, but he carried his assumptions the way he carried his badge, openly and without apology. When he had spoken those words at the graveside, the small gathered crowd of townspeople had shifted uncomfortably. Old Margaret Prout from the dry goods store had pressed her lips together. Reverend Hollies had cleared his throat. Nobody had contradicted him. Nobody except Lucy. She had turned to face him then, with the wind pulling at her ribbon and the first fistful of dirt falling on the lid of her father's coffin, and she had said, quietly and without heat, "That land belonged to Gerald Covington. It belongs to me now. I intend to see the harvest through." Haggerty had smiled in the way men sometimes smile when they are about to be patient with someone they consider foolish. "Lucy," he had said, "your father had a hired hand and 2 seasonal men to run that operation. You have nobody. The wheat comes due in 6 weeks. You cannot manage that alone, and no respectable ranch hand is going to take direction from a woman alone on that property. It is not the way things are done." "Then perhaps," she had said, turning back to the grave, "the way things are done needs some adjusting." She had heard him sigh behind her. She had heard the shuffle of boots as the townspeople looked at the ground or at the sky or at anything that was not the young woman refusing to be sensible. She had not cared about any of it. She had watched the dirt cover her father's coffin, and she had been thinking already about what needed to be done before first light the next morning. The Double C sat 4 miles east of Redrock Flats on land that ran along a creek the old maps called Sutter's Branch, though the original Sutter had been gone for 30 years, and nobody remembered him clearly anymore. The main house was solid and practical, built from limestone blocks her father had hauled himself, with a covered porch that faced west so a person could watch the sunsets. There were 2 barns, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a bunkhouse that currently stood empty, and 140 acres of wheat that would need to be harvested within the next 6 weeks or the whole season would be lost. Lucy spent the evening after the funeral sitting at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open in front of her and a lamp burning low, because she was already being careful with the kerosene. The numbers were honest and not particularly encouraging. Her father had been careful with money all his life, but ranching was expensive, and the drought 2 summers back had eaten into the reserves. There was enough to sustain the property through the winter if the harvest came in, and not enough to survive if it did not. She already knew this. She had been helping her father with the books since she was 16. But looking at the numbers herself in her own home, with the chair across from her permanently empty, felt different than looking at them beside him. She closed the ledger and went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time listening to the wind move through the wheat outside the window. That particular dry whisper that meant the stalks were ready, that the grain was waiting, that the clock was running. She fell asleep somewhere near midnight with her boots still on, and her jaw still set in that line her father had called her mother's line. By dawn, she was already at the fence line doing what she always did, which was walk the property and take its measure. The wheat stood tall and gold across the east fields, row upon row of it catching the early light, and looking at it, Lucy felt the pull of grief and love tangled together in a way that made her chest ache. Her father had planted this. She would bring it in. She needed help. She knew that with the same clear-eyed practicality with which she knew the price of flour at Prutt's store. One woman could not harvest 140 acres of wheat with a scythe and good intentions. She needed hands, which meant she needed to convince men to work for her, which Haggerty had already told her would not happen. She needed a harvesting machine, which required a team and an operator and cost money she did not currently have. Or she needed someone to come in on shares, which was possible but meant finding a person willing to negotiate with a woman who owned land. She was considering all of this when she heard a horse on the road. The man rode a roan gelding that moved with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had covered long distances and was comfortable with the prospect of covering more. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen better days and a hat that had seen worse ones. He had a bedroll tied behind the saddle and saddlebags that looked full and a rifle in the scabbard that he did not appear to be thinking about, which told Lucy something about the kind of man he was. Men who were worried about needing their guns kept them where their eyes could find them easily. He slowed the gelding when he saw her at the fence, and he touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture so automatic and genuine that it struck her as different from the performed gallantry she was accustomed to from men in town. "Morning," he said. He had a low voice, not particularly loud, with the kind of steadiness that suggested it did not often need to be loud to carry. "Morning," she said. She watched him the way she watched everything, directly and with attention. He looked at the wheat behind her and then back at her. "That your field?" "It is. Ready to come in." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were dark, somewhere between brown and green in the shifting morning light, set in a face that had spent considerable time outdoors. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years past it, with the kind of stillness around him that was either confidence or exhaustion, and Lucy suspected it was both. "You looking for hands?" he asked. "Depends," she said. "On what?" "On whether the hand in question takes direction without deciding he knows better." He considered this without smiling, which she appreciated. Some men would have laughed. "I know wheat," he said. "I don't know this ground. You know it better than me." It was not exactly an answer to what she had asked, but it was an honest one, and Lucy had spent enough years watching men construct comfortable fictions that she had developed a strong preference for honesty even when it was incomplete. "Silas Malone," she said. He blinked. "Excuse me." "That is your name," she said. There was a Silas Malone, who worked the Hartley spread 2 counties over 2 harvests ago. The Hartley foreman told my father the man was the best operator he had seen with a McCormick reaper, and that he left because Hartley tried to underpay him for a second season. There was a pause. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the precondition of one. "You have a good memory," he said. "I have a good ear for information that might be useful later," she said. "I am Lucy Covington. This is the double C my father passed 4 days ago, and I have 140 acres of wheat that needs to come in within 6 weeks. I do not have a reaper, but I know where I can hire one if I have an operator who knows how to handle it without tearing up the field. I am offering standard wages plus a percentage of the net on the harvest, which I can lay out in writing if you want to see it before you agree." He sat on the gelding for a moment and she watched him think, which was something she could actually watch because he was not the kind of man who thought in directions he was trying to hide from her. He looked at the wheat again and then at the house and then at her. "What percentage?" he said. 8, she said. 10, 9, and meals included. He stepped down from the saddle. He was taller than she had expected, and there was a quiet authority to the way he moved that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with a man who was accustomed to work that required his full body and full attention. He held out his hand and she shook it, and his grip was firm and matched hers without trying to overpower it, which was the kind of small thing that told her more about a person than most conversations could. "All right, Miss Covington," he said. "Where do you want to start?" She showed him the property with the thoroughness of someone who had memorized it the way other people memorize scripture, which was to say completely, and with an understanding of what each piece meant in relation to every other piece. She showed him the soil in the east field, darker and richer near the creek, shallower and drier at the north edge, where the rock shelf ran under it. She showed him the barn where the tools were kept and the small wagon she used for moving supplies. She told him about the way the afternoon wind came in from the southwest, and why that mattered for which direction you took the rows. He listened the way he had sat on the horse, with his full attention and without interruption, and when she had finished, he asked 3 specific questions about the north field and the shallow soil that told her he had been paying close enough attention to understand the problem before she had named it. "We can take the north section last," he said, "and work it at a different angle. Keep the machine from fighting the rock shelf." "That is what I was thinking," she said. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already half decided. "I will need to ride to town to arrange the reaper hire. You want to send a message ahead?" "I want to come with you," she said. He looked at her for half a second and then said, "All right," without the hesitation or qualification she had been bracing for. They rode to Redrock Flats together, Lucy on her father's bay mare and Silas on the roan, and the town was already busy with the morning business of a Tuesday in late September. The feed store was open, the smithy was ringing, and 2 men in front of the saloon were examining a broken wagon wheel with the focused despair of men who had run out of better options. Sheriff Haggerty was standing in front of his office when they rode past, and he watched them with the particular expression of a man who has predicted something and is irritated by the sight of it potentially being proven wrong. He called out to Lucy as they passed. "Miss Covington," he said, "I hope you are not making a rash decision about that property." Lucy reined in her horse because ignoring a sheriff was impractical even when it was tempting. "I am arranging my harvest, Sheriff," she said, "which I expect you will find I am capable of completing on time." Haggerty's gaze moved to Silas with the professional assessment of a lawman taking the measure of a stranger. "Who is this?" He said. "Silas Malone," Silas said from the saddle, his tone even and without challenge but also without the particular quality of deference that Haggerty was probably expecting. "Hired hand for the Double C. You know this man," Haggerty said to Lucy. "I do," she said. "Where is he from?" "I am from Abilene originally," Silas said, still pleasantly. "More recently from the Hartley spread in Calhoun County." "I can provide references if you need them, Sheriff, but I should mention that Miss Covington has already done her due diligence." Haggerty studied them both with the flat look of authority that has been mildly maneuvered into a corner. "This is a small town," he said, to neither of them specifically. "People notice things." "Good morning, Sheriff," Lucy said, and she moved the mare forward and Silas rode alongside her, and she heard Haggerty make a sound behind them that was not quite a word. The Deaver Brothers Equipment Hire was at the south end of town, run by a man named Cal Deaver who smelled of machine oil and chewing tobacco, and had the cheerful disposition of someone whose livelihood was currently in strong demand. He had a McCormick reaper for hire and a header box, and a pair of draft horses that could run the rig, and his expression when Lucy walked in ahead of Silas was one of visible surprise followed by rapid recalibration when he saw that she intended to conduct the business herself. Silas stayed a step behind her and let her negotiate, which she did with the precision of someone who had been doing sums in a ledger since before she was old enough for the numbers to have fully made sense to her. She knew the going rate for equipment hire. She knew how many days the job would take, and she did not allow herself to be quoted a price that was higher than the standard without noting it directly and asking for the reasoning. Cal Deaver, to his credit, revised his initial figure when she named the going rate without blinking, and by the time they had shaken hands on the agreement, she had him scheduled to deliver the rig to the Double C on the following Monday morning. "Your operator there," Deaver said, nodding at Silas. "He is," Lucy said. "Good enough," Deaver said, with the equanimity of a man who had decided that competence was competence regardless of who was signing the paperwork. As they walked back toward their horses, Silas said, "You did not need me for that." "I needed you to be there," she said. "Deaver would have charged me a third more if I had walked in alone." "Would he have?" "He started to," she said. "Having you standing behind me made him reconsider." Silas was quiet for a moment as they reached the horses. "That bothers me," he said, and the way he said it told her he meant it straightforwardly, as a statement of principle rather than a bid for her approval. "It bothers me more," she said, "but I am practical about it." He nodded slowly. He untied the roan and stood with the reins in his hands looking at the street, at the town going about its Tuesday business with the ordinariness of a place that had not recently had cause to think about what it expected of young women who inherited land. "I do not intend to take over anything that is yours," he said. "I want to be clear about that." Lucy looked at him for a moment. There was something in the plainness of the statement that moved through her in a way she was not entirely prepared for, a warmth that she attributed quickly and sensibly to the straightforwardness of a professional arrangement going well. "I appreciate that, Mr. Malone," she said. "Silas," he said. "Silas," she said. They rode back to the Double C in the early afternoon with the sun high and the dust settling slowly on the road behind them, and there was a quality to the silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which Lucy found more noteworthy than she admitted to herself. The first week was hard in the way that physical labor is always hard, which is honest and exhausting and oddly clarifying. While they waited for the reaper to arrive Monday, there was plenty to do. Silas repaired 3 sections of fence along the north field that had been listing badly, and he did it without being asked, which Lucy noticed because she had been about to ask. He checked the draft horse traces that came with the property and found a worn section, and replaced it with spare leather from the barn, without making a production of having caught something she had missed. He worked methodically and thoroughly, and when he did not know where something was he asked rather than searching on his own, which suggested a respect for the organization of the place that she had not expected to find in a man who had arrived as a stranger. Lucy, for her part, was everywhere at once. She was managing the remaining cattle, a dozen head that still needed tending despite the harvest pressure. She was preserving the last of the summer garden for the winter stores, putting up tomatoes and beans and corn in the root cellar the way her father had taught her. She was keeping the books current and planning the harvest rotation and making sure the water supply to the east field was sound. She was doing all of this and cooking 3 meals a day because that was what the arrangement included, and she did it without complaint, which was not to say without tiredness. On the 3rd evening, she came in from the cellar to find that Silas had started the fire in the kitchen stove without being asked, and had put the pot on for coffee. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of leather and an awl, working on a saddle repair by lamplight, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Coffee will be ready in a few minutes. I hope that is all right." She stood in the doorway for a moment. She was dirty from the root cellar and tired in her bones, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee, and there was a man sitting at her father's table doing useful work quietly in the lamplight, and the combination of these things did something complicated to her chest that she resolved to think about later when she was not so tired. "That is more than all right," she said. They drank coffee together, and he asked her about the harvest rotation she was planning, and she showed him the layout she had sketched on paper, the order in which she wanted to take the fields, and he looked at it seriously, and said the order made sense, and suggested one modification to the south field timing based on the direction of the afternoon wind, and she thought about it and agreed with him and made the change. It was the most natural conversation she had had with another person since her father died, and that fact sat with her quietly as she finished her coffee. "How did you end up working harvests?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the leather he was working. "My family had a farm in Kansas," he said. "Broke up when I was 18. Drought took most of it and my father sold what was left, and my older brother went to Wichita and I went with a crew of seasonal men who were moving south with the season. Learned the McCormick on that first harvest. Turned out I was good at it." He said this last part without pride or modesty, just as a fact. "Better at keeping machines running than at sitting still." "How long have you been moving with the season?" she asked. He counted something in his head. 11 years. "Do you ever want to stop?" He looked at her across the lamp. It was a more personal question than she had intended to ask, and she saw him recognize that, and she saw him decide to answer honestly anyway. "I have been thinking about it," he said. "More lately." She did not ask him why more lately, because she was sensible enough to know that the honest answer might be something she was not ready to hear, and she was practical enough to know that she needed him to finish the harvest before anything else became relevant. The reaper arrived Monday morning as scheduled, Cal Deaver driving the rig with his nephew riding alongside. And the thing was enormous and loud and beautiful in the particular way that practical machinery is beautiful when you understand what it can do. Silas was out of the bunkhouse and into the field with it before Deaver had finished unhitching his delivery wagon, and Lucy stood at the edge of the east field and watched Silas bring the machine alive, his hands moving over it with the fluency of long familiarity, checking tensions and alignments with a kind of focused tenderness that she recognized as the affection a skilled person has for the tools of their skill. Deaver watched him work and glanced at Lucy. "He is good," he said, with the plain acknowledgement of someone who knows the difference between competent and exceptional. "I know," she said. The first pass through the east field was magnificent. The machine moved through the wheat like intention made physical, cutting and gathering and depositing in one clean motion, and behind it the rows fell in perfect ordered lines, the golden grain giving itself up with a kind of dignity that made Lucy's throat close unexpectedly. This was her father's wheat. This was the thing he had planted with his own hands, and tended through dry weeks and nervous weeks, and the weeks after her mother died, when he had still gone out every morning because the wheat did not know about grief and would not wait for it. She did not cry, because she was not a person who cried in front of people she had known for less than 2 weeks, but she stood at the edge of the field with the morning sun at her back and watched the harvest begin and felt the weight and the rightness of it settle into her chest like something that had been waiting to land. She had brought on 2 additional men from town by then, Reuben Cole and a younger man named Pete Aldridge, both seasonal workers she had hired through careful inquiry and straightforward negotiation. Reuben was 50 and had been working harvests for 30 years, and was the kind of worker who did exactly what was required of him with complete reliability and no particular warmth, which Lucy valued because reliability was what the harvest needed. Pete was 22 and quick and eager to prove himself, which made him useful but required some management, and Lucy managed him with a directness that initially surprised him and eventually earned her his unambiguous respect. Haggerty came out to the property on the second day of the harvest. He rode out in the early afternoon when the cutting was in full swing, the reaper moving through the middle of the east field with Silas at the helm and Reuben and Pete stacking and binding behind it, and Lucy was working alongside them, her hair pinned under her hat, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her father's work gloves on her hands, doing the same labor as the men around her without apology or self-consciousness. Haggerty rode up to the fence and sat there for a while without saying anything, watching. Then he called out to her, "Miss Covington." She finished binding the sheaf she was working on before she walked over to him, and she saw him notice this and decide not to comment on it. "Sheriff," she said. "This is quite an operation," he said. There was something reluctant in his tone, the quality of a man who had committed to a prediction and was watching the early evidence against it accumulate. "It is a harvest," she said, "which is what I told you I would manage." "I wanted to discuss the matter of the property title," he said. "There are some in town who believe that without a male heir or a husband, the title may be contested." Lucy looked at him steadily. "On what legal basis?" He shifted in the saddle. "It is a complicated matter." "It is not, in fact," she said. "My father's will is clear and was filed with the county recorder's office 2 years ago. The double C passes to me in full. I would recommend that anyone who wishes to contest that speak to the county recorder directly, because they will find the conversation brief and educational." Haggerty looked at her with the expression of a man who had come expecting to manage a problem and had instead encountered a wall. "There is also the matter of the note on the property," he said, and now his tone had shifted slightly, taking on the quality of information carefully deployed. Lucy felt something sharpen in her chest, but she did not let it move her face. "What note?" "Your father took a small loan last spring from the Cattlemen's Bank in Amarillo, $120. I understand the payment schedule may be of some concern given the current situation." She had known about the loan. What she had not known was that Haggerty knew about it, which meant that someone at the bank had been talking. She thought about the numbers in the ledger. The loan payment was due in November after the harvest. If the harvest came in, there was no issue. Haggerty was telling her this now during the harvest as a way of telling her something else, which was that there were people watching and waiting for her to fail. "Thank you for the information," she said, with a control that cost her something. "The payment will be met after the harvest is sold." Haggerty looked at her for a long moment, and then at Silas moving the reaper through the wheat and then back at her. He touched his hat. "Good day, Miss Covington," he said, and he rode back the way he had come. Lucy stood watching him go until he was small on the road, and then she turned back to the field and picked up the next sheaf and started binding. Silas had slowed the reaper, and she could feel him watching her from across the rows. When she glanced up, he did not look away with the discomfort of someone who had been caught observing something private. He met her eyes across the cut wheat, and there was something in his expression that was neither pity nor reassessment, just a recognition that whatever that had been, she had handled it, and he was going to proceed accordingly. She found, as the days accumulated, that working alongside Silas Malone was unlike working with anyone she had worked with before. He was not trying to take her lead and simultaneously override it, which was what most men did, the performance of deference that concealed the assumption of authority. He was also not performing servility, which she had encountered from men who resented being managed by a woman and expressed it through exaggerated compliance. He was simply working, as a partner works, bringing his own knowledge to bear without eclipsing hers, asking when he did not know and answering honestly when asked. On the 6th evening he came in from the field with a problem he had found in the north section, a section of soil that was drier than expected and would cause the reaper's binding mechanism trouble if they hit it head-on. He had a proposed solution, which involved adjusting the approach angle, and he brought it to her at the kitchen table and laid it out with a sketch he had made in the dirt of the yard, and then copied onto a scrap of paper. And they talked it through together, and the solution they arrived at was better than either of them had started with. And when they reached it, she could see him recognize that fact the same way she did. "My father used to say the best plans come from two minds on the same problem," she said. "Your father sounds like he was a smart man," Silas said. "He was," she said. There was a pause that was comfortable in the way silences become comfortable when the people sharing them have earned it through days of honest work. "He would have liked you," she said, and then she was briefly surprised at herself for saying it, because it was a more personal thing than she had meant to offer. Silas looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "That matters to me," he said, just as quietly, and the plainness of it was somehow the most affecting thing he could have said. The days moved in the rhythm of the harvest, early mornings and long hours, and the slow satisfaction of watching the rows diminish as the stacked sheaves multiplied. Lucy's hands were rough from the binding and her shoulders ached in the evenings, and she was sleeping better than she had in years, the deep, dreamless sleep of a body that has been used fully and honestly. She was also, in the evenings when they sat over the accounts or the coffee, or nothing in particular, becoming aware of Silas Malone with a specificity that went beyond the professional. She noticed the way he pushed his hat back when he was thinking about something, revealing the lighter line of skin at his forehead where the sun had not reached it. She noticed that he laughed quietly, without performance, at things that genuinely struck him as funny and not at things that did not. She noticed that he was careful with the horses in the particular way that told her they were not tools to him but living things that deserved consideration. She noticed that in the evenings, when Reuben and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, he would sometimes read from a small book he kept in his coat pocket, and when she asked him what it was he had shown her without self-consciousness, it was a collection of natural history essays by someone she had not heard of, and he had said he had been carrying it for 3 years and still had not finished it because he kept rereading sections rather than moving on. "What draws you back to it?" she asked, looking at the dog-eared pages. "The writing is honest about what the writer does not know," he said. "Most books on nature pretend to certainty they do not have. This one admits that the world is more complicated than any set of descriptions, and I find that reassuring." She looked at him for a moment. Why reassuring? He thought about it. "Because I find it reassuring when honest things are said plainly," he said. "It makes me trust the rest of what is in the book." She understood this in a way that was immediate and complete, and that had nothing specifically to do with books about nature. She went to bed that night with the feeling of something shifting, slowly toward a configuration she had not quite prepared for. It was on the 15th day of the harvest, with the east fields finished and the south field half done, that something happened which changed the quality of things. The afternoon had been warm for late October, the sky cloudless and the light long and gold, and they were working the south field when Pete Aldridge's binding twine caught on the reaper's cutting bar, and Silas stopped the machine quickly, but not before the bar kicked back and struck Pete across the forearm. It was not a severe injury, a deep bruise and a gash that bled freely, but it was enough to put Pete out of commission for the rest of the day, and Reuben took him back to the bunkhouse to be cleaned and wrapped, and that left Lucy and Silas alone in the south field with 2 hours of good light remaining. They could have stopped for the day. That was the sensible thing, and Silas did not suggest they continue, only looked at the remaining rows and then at her with an inquiring expression that put the decision entirely with her. She looked at the field, at the work remaining, at the light in the sky. "Let us finish this row," she said. So it was just the two of them in the long golden afternoon, and the quality of the silence was different from the silence of a full crew. It was quieter and more present, just the sound of the reaper and the wheat falling, and the birds that moved ahead of the cutting, rising and settling again behind them. Lucy was binding at the back of the pass, and Silas was at the helm, and they worked in a rhythm that had by this point become so natural that it felt like a single organism, moving through the field rather than two separate people. When the light was beginning to go amber and long, they reached the end of the row, and Silas stopped the machine and stepped down, and they stood together at the far edge of the south field looking back at what they had accomplished. The cut field stretched behind them, the rows clean and even, the sheaves standing in their ordered groups, and the remaining uncut section was perhaps a quarter of the field, which they would finish tomorrow. "Good day's work," Silas said. "It is," she said. They stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she was aware of him beside her with the particularity of awareness that she had been gently, sensibly, practically trying to keep at a manageable level for the past 2 weeks, and that this particular evening in this particular golden light was making that management more difficult than usual. He turned to look at her, and she turned at the same moment, and they were closer than she had calculated, which was not a calculation she had made but would have, had she been thinking practically rather than about the light on the cut wheat. He was looking at her with an expression that was direct and open in the way of a man who had decided not to pretend about what he was feeling, and she found that she could not pretend about it either, which surprised her. "Lucy," he said, Just that. Just her name in that low, even voice, and the way he said it had the quality of a door opened carefully, with attention to whether the person inside wanted it opened. And she thought about all the things she was not ready for, and all the things that the harvest still required, and all the things that a practical woman with a property to run and a loan to pay and a sheriff watching for her to fail ought to be thinking about. And then she looked at him looking at her and said, "Yes." He raised one hand and very carefully, with the same deliberate gentleness he used with the horses, tucked a strand of her hair back under her hat where it had escaped in the afternoon wind. His fingers barely grazed her temple, and the contact was so measured and so respectful that it had none of the performance of romantic gesture and all of the weight of genuine feeling, and she stood still under his hand and looked at him and felt something in her chest open like a field in spring. "I think," he said quietly, "that I would very much like to stay." She understood him completely. "Through the harvest," she said carefully. "And after," he said just as carefully, giving it to her to decide. She looked at him for a long moment in the last of the day's light. This man who listened and worked and told honest things plainly. This man who had asked rather than assumed, who had stood behind her at the equipment hire and tucked her hair back with the same thoughtfulness. And she said, "Let us finish the harvest first." He nodded, and the beginning of that smile appeared, and she turned back toward the house before she could let the feeling in her chest override the practical timeline she was committed to. But she was aware of him walking beside her all the way back across the cut field, and through the warm evening air, and it was, she thought with a kind of helpless clarity, a very pleasant awareness to have. They finished the harvest in 23 days total. The north field had been the hardest, as she had predicted, the shallow soil fighting the reaper's mechanism in exactly the ways she and Silas had anticipated and prepared for. But the adjusted angle worked, and Reuben, whose arm had healed enough to return to work 3 days later, proved invaluable in the difficult sections, and Pete worked with the focused care of someone who had been reminded that machinery requires respect. The last section of the north field fell on a cool morning in the second week of October, and Lucy stood at the edge of it and looked at the full harvest, standing in its ordered rows across all 140 acres of the Double C. And she thought about her father with a grief and a pride so mixed together she could not have said which was which. She had it weighed the following day. The county grain agent, a meticulous man named Arthur Greer, came out from Redrock Flats with his measuring tools and his ledger, and he walked the harvest with the professional attention of a man who was good at his work, and when he was done, he gave her the figure. It was a strong harvest, not exceptional but strong, well above what she needed to cover the loan payment and the operating costs, and Silas and Reuben and Pete's wages, and the equipment hire, and still leave a reserve for the winter. She wrote the numbers in her father's ledger in her own hand, and sat with them for a moment, and then she closed the ledger and went outside. Silas was at the barn with the draft horses that were due to go back to Deaver the following day. He was working them with hay and water with the thoroughness of a man who takes care of things that have been loaned to him, and he looked up when she came into the barn and saw something in her face. "How did it come in?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Better than I needed." He stood looking at her across the dim barn for a moment, and then he set down the hayfork and came to where she was standing, and he took her hand in both of his with the careful directness that had come to feel like his particular way of telling her things that mattered. "Your father would have been proud," he said. She had been practical and controlled for 23 days, and she allowed herself, there in the barn in the early afternoon light with the smell of hay and horses and the harvest done and her father's ledger closed on good numbers, to press her other hand briefly over the back of his and hold on. "Yes," she said. "I believe he would have." It was the next morning that Sheriff Haggerty rode out. He arrived shortly after breakfast, while Arthur Greer's tally sheet was still on the kitchen table alongside the open ledger, and Lucy was fully prepared when she heard the horse because she had been expecting him for 2 days. She came out onto the porch to meet him rather than waiting for him to knock. Haggerty dismounted and tied his horse and came to the foot of the porch steps, and he looked up at her standing on the porch with the practiced composure of a woman who has done what she said she would do. He had his hat in his hand, which she noted. "Miss Covington," he said. "Sheriff." He glanced behind her at the house, at the open door through which the tally sheet was probably visible on the table, and then back at her. "I understand the harvest is in," he said. "It is," she said. "Come in if you would like to see the figures." He came up the steps, which she thought was a kind of concession, however small, and she showed him the ledger and the grain agent's tally with the same directness she had shown him in the field 3 weeks ago, and he looked at the numbers and she watched him process what they said, which was that she had been right and he had been wrong in the simplest possible mathematical terms. "These are strong numbers," he said. "Yes," she said. "The note will be paid in November in full." He held his hat in his hands and looked at it for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said, and she could hear that it cost him something to say it, not because he was a dishonest man, but because he had been comprehensively wrong in public, and that was never easy for a man who wore his authority the way Haggerty wore his. "I should not have said what I said at the graveside." She looked at him steadily. She was not interested in letting him off easily, but she was also not a person who found satisfaction in prolonged recrimination. "No," she said, "you should not have. This land is mine. I intend to run it. And I would appreciate it if you would communicate that clearly to anyone in town who has been discussing the title." "I will," he said. He meant it. She could tell. "Thank you," she said. "Good morning, Sheriff." He put his hat on and walked back down the steps and untied his horse, and he looked up at her once more before he mounted, with an expression that was not quite admiration but was in that direction. Then he rode back down the road toward Redrock Flats, and he had weighed the harvest before he left town. Silas was leaning against the fence at the edge of the yard, watching the sheriff's dust settle on the road. He had positioned himself there, she realized, with the specific purpose of being visible while remaining out of the conversation, which was exactly the right thing to have done, a presence without intrusion. She came down off the porch and walked to where he was standing and stood beside him looking down the road. "What will you do now?" he asked. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it in the margins of the harvest for the past week, in the quiet of the evenings and the early mornings, the question of what came next. The wheat was in. The cattle still needed tending. The land needed a winter plan and a plan for the spring planting, and all the accumulated work of a ranch that intended to continue being a ranch. There was a great deal to do, and she knew how to do it, and she was not afraid of any of it. "I am going to plant wheat in the spring," she said, "and I am going to look at adding a section of oats because the soil near the creek can support it and the price has been strong. I am going to repair the south barn roof before the first hard freeze, and I am going to hire Reuben for the winter if he is willing because he is reliable and the cattle need consistent tending." Silas nodded slowly. He was looking at the horizon, and there was the particular quality of stillness about him that she had come to read over 3 weeks of close attention, as the quality he had when he was deciding whether to say something. "You said," she said, not looking at him, "that you wanted to stay." "I did," he said. "Is that still what you want?" He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and it was morning, not a golden late afternoon but the plain light of an October morning, and she thought it was probably a better time to have the conversation anyway, clear light being better than beautiful light for conversations that needed to be seen clearly. "Yes," he said. "It is what I want." Want it? She considered him, this man who had listened and worked and stayed behind her when it mattered and stepped forward when she needed him to, who had tucked her hair back with one careful hand and asked rather than assumed, who had an unfinished book in his coat pocket that he kept rereading because he trusted honest writing more than certain writing. She thought about the 11 years he had moved with the seasons and the way he had looked at the wheat that first morning and the way he had looked at her. "I want it," she said, "but I want to be clear about what that means." "Tell me," he said. "This is my ranch," she said. "It will remain my ranch. I will make the decisions about the land and the livestock and the operations, and I will want your knowledge and your work and your opinion, and I will give you mine, and the final word on this property will be mine." "I understand that," he said. "I would not have it otherwise." "You would not?" "No," he said, "I would not." She looked at him for a moment longer. "All right," she said. "Then you can stay." He smiled then, the full version of it, and it was a good smile, open and warm and without anything in it that wanted to take something from her. "Thank you, Lucy," he said. "Thank me after you fix the south barn roof," she said. "I need that done before the freeze." He laughed, which was the sound she had been storing up the instances of without meaning to, low and genuine and warm in the morning air. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with no irony at all. There was a period after the harvest that could only be described as a beginning, because that is what it was. The ranch moved into its winter work, and Silas moved into the rhythm of it, as if he had been doing it for years, which he had in the sense that long seasons on different ranches give a man a comprehensive education in the work. And the Double C under Lucy's management was organized and logical, and he took to it with visible ease. He fixed the south barn roof before the first freeze, as she had asked, and the job he did on it was better than the original construction, the new planking fitted with care and sealed against the weather. Reuben agreed to stay on for the winter and proved to be the kind of winter hand Lucy had hoped for, steady and self-contained, and not inclined to make conversation for the sake of it, which suited the quiet winter days. Pete Aldridge had gone to Amarillo for the winter but had promised to come back for the spring planting, and she had shaken his hand on it because he had been good work, and she was already thinking about the oat section. The loan payment was made in full in the first week of November. She rode to Amarillo herself and paid the bank officer across the desk and received the receipt, and rode back with the paper in her coat pocket and the weather turning cold around her. When she got home, Silas had the stove going and the coffee on, and she sat down at the kitchen table and put the receipt on the table in front of her and looked at it for a long moment. "Done," she said. He sat across from her and looked at the receipt and then at her. "How does it feel?" "Like the ground under my feet is solid," she said. They were not yet what they would become. The evenings were still careful, still held at the particular temperature of people who have admitted something important, and are now being thoughtful about what comes next. But the care itself had a warmth to it, a quality of attention that was not restraint so much as savoring, and she found that she enjoyed this stage of things, this slow, deliberate movement toward each other that felt like choosing rather than falling. He did not presume. This was the thing she kept returning to in the evenings when she sat with her book or her ledger, and was aware of him across the room with his own book. He did not presume that her agreement to his staying constituted anything more than she had specifically said, and she respected that precision. But he was present in the way that mattered, in the small daily ways, the coffee started, and the door held, and the problems discussed as equals and the evenings that stretched out comfortably, because neither of them was uncomfortable. And these small presences accumulated over the weeks of November into something she could not have named but could feel clearly, the shape of a life being built rather than merely maintained. It was in December, on a night when the first hard snow had fallen and the ranch was quiet and white and sealed against the dark, that she told him about her mother. They had been sitting by the fire after supper, and Silas had asked her about the quilt on the back of the settee, a particularly beautiful piece, and she had told him her mother had made it the winter before she died, and that Lucy had been 9 and Clara Covington had been 31, and that watching her father run the ranch alone after that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to love a piece of land. Because he had loved it partly as a way of loving the woman who was gone and whose hands had touched everything in that house. Silas listened to all of this with the full attention she had come to rely on, and when she was done he said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Lucy said. "So was he, and I am. She said this last part without apology or self-consciousness, just as a statement of fact, and she saw him take it that way. "You are," he said. "Remarkable is the word." She looked at him across the fire. The snow outside made the silence total, that particular winter silence that is not emptiness but fullness, the world muffled and concentrated. "Tell me about Kansas," she said. He told her. He told her about the farm his father had built on ground that was good for 3 or 4 years before the wind started taking the topsoil, and how his father had known this, but stayed anyway because the farm was what he had and hope was what he had beyond that. He told her about his brother, James, who was in Wichita now and had a hardware business, and wrote to Silas twice a year with news that was reassuring in its ordinariness. He told her about the day the farm had finally been sold, and the way his father's face had looked, not broken but emptied, and how that image had stayed with him because he recognized it as what happened to a man who had loved something and lost it. "Is that why you kept moving?" she asked quietly. He thought about it. "Partly," he said. "I did not want to build something and watch it go. It seemed safer to stay uncommitted." "And now," she said. He looked at her across the fire with the directness that was one of his most consistent qualities. "Now I think the only thing more painful than losing something you built would be refusing to build anything at all," he said. "I think I have been making a mistake for a long time, and I was fortunate enough to be riding past your fence line before the season ended." She held this for a moment, the weight and the honesty of it. "You are not making a mistake," she said. "I know," he said. "Because you would tell me." "I would," she said, plainly and immediately. He smiled, and she smiled back, and outside the snow continued to fall on the double sea in the silence of a winter night, and inside the fire was warm, and she thought that her father would have sat across from this man in this room and been satisfied with what he saw. Christmas in Red Rock Flats in 1882 was a modest affair, as it generally was in a small ranching town where most people had practical concerns and limited discretionary funds. The Hollies Church put on a service, and there was a gathering at the Prout store and a modest dance at the hall above the feed store. Lucy went to the dance with Silas and did not miss the way the town received this information, the adjustment of expressions and the recalibration of assumptions that happened when they walked in together. Margaret Prout, who was 70 and had earned the right to say whatever she thought, took Lucy's hands and held them and said, "Your father would have approved." She said it looking at Silas as she said it, which made her meaning clear. "I think so too," Lucy said. Haggerty was there. He crossed the room to them and shook Silas's hand and said something brief and civil about the harvest, and Silas said something brief and civil back, and it was not warmth but it was the foundation of neutral respect, which was enough. When Haggerty turned away, Lucy felt Silas's hand find the small of her back, not proprietorial but present, asking, and she leaned into it slightly, which was her answer. They danced twice, because she was not a person who danced for the performance of it, but she was a person who liked to move well with a partner, and she found that Silas danced with the same quality he brought to everything physical, a capable and attentive and generous engagement that made it easy and pleasant. He was not showing off and he was not enduring it. He was simply dancing with her, and when the music slowed, he was close enough that she could smell the cold night air still in his coat, and the faint warmth of the coffee they had had before leaving the ranch, and she thought with a sudden clarity and completeness that she was in love with him. She had known this was coming for some time, and had been walking toward it with deliberate attention rather than being overtaken by it, which was the way she preferred to arrive at important recognitions. But the actual moment of knowing was still surprising in the way that confirmed truths always are, like stepping on ground you have tested carefully, and finding it is exactly as solid as you believed. She did not say it that night, because it was a dance and not a conversation, but she thought about it all the way back to the ranch in the cold, clear night with the stars enormous, and the road white with packed snow. And when she looked over at him on the road beside her, he was looking up at the sky with an expression of such complete and unguarded peacefulness that she almost said it then. She said it 2 days after Christmas, in the kitchen after supper, the same kitchen where everything that mattered seemed to happen. Said, "I love you," in the direct, plain way she said everything that mattered, and he stopped what he was doing, which was drying a dish with the methodical patience of a man who does the small things well, and he turned and looked at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly but more like relief, the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. "Lucy," he said. "I know," she said, "but I wanted to say it plainly." He set the dish down and came across the kitchen and took her face in both hands with the same measured gentleness that characterized everything he did with something he cared about. And he said, "I love you," the same way she had said it, directly and without embellishment. And she put her hands over his where they cupped her face, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm kitchen with the fire going and the snow outside and the ranch quiet around them. And it was, she thought, exactly as it should be. He kissed her then, slowly and carefully, and she kissed him back with the same care and none of the restraint she had been exercising for 3 months. And when they finally moved apart, she was still holding his hands against her face and they were both slightly out of breath, and she was smiling in the way she rarely smiled in public, wide and unguarded and entirely herself. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "I would still like you to fix the north fence line in the spring," she said. He laughed the full laugh, the one she had been collecting, and she thought it was a fine thing to have done. The winter settled over the Double C with the patient severity of a Texas panhandle winter, cold and dry, and periodically spectacular with ice storms that turned the world into glass for 2 or 3 days at a time before the temperature rose, and the world became mud, and then ordinary again. They worked the ranch together through all of it, the feeding and the water troughs and the cattle who needed tending regardless of the weather, and the evenings were long and warm and theirs. Silas asked her to marry him in February. He did it on a clear, cold morning when she was at the fence looking at the north field, bare now and showing the dark soil, and he came and stood beside her and said, "I have been thinking about the spring planting." "What about it?" she said. "I have been thinking that I would like to plan it as someone who will be here for many springs," he said, "not as a hired hand." She looked at him. He was looking at the field, which gave her a moment to look at him fully, this man who had arrived on a roan horse 11 years deep into moving and had stopped. He had not become a different man. He was the same man he had been when he stepped down from the gelding and shook her hand at the fence line, and she thought that was important, that the man she had fallen in love with was not a transformation or a correction of what he had been before, just a man who had decided to put down roots in the right soil. He turned and looked at her. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that he had made in Amarillo on the same trip she had made to pay the bank note, and she stared at it because she had not expected this. It was a plain gold band set with a small turquoise stone, nothing extravagant but chosen with clear attention, the stone the color of the sky on the kind of morning she loved best, the clear cold blue of a winter sky over the panhandle. "How long have you been carrying that?" she said. "Since November," he said, and the sheepishness of this was so unlike his general composure that she started laughing, and he started laughing, and she held out her hand and he put the ring on her finger, and they stood at the fence on the north field in February with the cold air and the bare soil, and the long season of good work ahead of them, and laughed like people who have found something they were not expecting to find and cannot quite believe it is real. They married in April, 2 weeks before the spring planting began, in the Hollies church with the whole small town of Redrock Flats in attendance, because a wedding was a wedding, and Redrock Flats did not have so many of them that they could afford to be selective about attendance. Reverend Hollies performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who has done many weddings and believes in getting the important words said without unnecessary embellishment. And Lucy stood at the front of the church in her mother's dress, which fit her with a few alterations, and said her vows to Silas in the plain, direct way she said everything, looking at him and meaning every word. Silas's vows were not long, but they were considered because he had written them himself, and she could hear the days of working over them, the selection of words that were honest rather than decorative. He promised to work beside her and not in front of or behind her. He promised to speak his mind and listen to hers. He promised to care for the double C as if it were his own, by which he meant with the specific knowledge that it was hers, and his care was given in service of her ownership rather than alongside it. She held these words carefully as he said them, and tucked them away in the place where she kept things she intended to keep. Margaret Prout cried. Reuben Cole stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who found emotion manageable in small doses. Pete Aldridge had returned from Amarillo, as he had promised, and stood next to Reuben, and looked moved in the way of young men who have not yet had occasion to be moved very often, and are therefore moved fully when the occasion arises. Sheriff Haggerty sat in a middle pew and applauded with everyone else at the end, and when he came through the line afterward and shook Silas's hand and took Lucy's hand and said, "I believe you will do well together," she felt that it was both an apology and a compliment, and she accepted it as both. The spring planting was the first thing they planned entirely as partners, the wheat in the east and south fields, and the oat section near the creek that Lucy had been thinking about since the previous autumn. The oat section was Silas's project in the sense that he had the most specific knowledge of what the soil there could support, and he planned it with the meticulous care he brought to everything, testing the soil and adjusting the spacing, and choosing the seed variety with a thoroughness that she watched with the particular satisfaction of seeing a person do the thing they are genuinely good at. The spring was good. The rain came at the right intervals, which was never a certainty in the Texas panhandle and always felt like a gift when it happened. And the wheat came up strong, and the oats came up even stronger, the soil near the creek proving to be exactly what Lucy had suspected it was and Silas had confirmed it was, which is to say excellent. They rode the fields in the evenings sometimes, after the day's work, just to see what was there, and there was something about riding side by side through the young grain that felt to her like the best version of everything she had wanted for the double C. It was in June, 4 months after the wedding and 3 months into the spring growing, that Lucy began to suspect she was expecting a child. She confirmed it in July, and told Silas on a Tuesday evening after supper with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where everything important happened and saying, "I believe we are going to have a child in early winter." He sat still for a moment, and she watched his face move through something she could only call wonder, the kind of wonder that is so complete it becomes temporarily speechless. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. This was the first thing he asked, and it told her everything she already knew about him. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. He held her hand and looked at it and then looked at her. "A child," he said, as if tasting the word. "Yes," she said, "though the harvest still comes first, I am afraid." He laughed. "Of course it does," he said, and squeezed her hand. "The harvest always comes first on the double C." The summer moved through its long hot weeks with the work that summer required, and Lucy worked through most of it as she had always worked, which frustrated Silas a little in the way that a person is frustrated when they cannot protect someone they love from something that is not actually dangerous. She pointed out to him, with some patience, that women on ranches worked through pregnancies regularly, and that she was healthy and capable and knew very well the difference between appropriate effort and foolishness, and that if she felt unwell she would say so, and in the meantime he should trust her judgment about her own body. He heard this and agreed to it, and mostly kept his worrying to the mornings when he thought she was not watching, which she was, and which she found genuinely endearing. The second harvest came in strong. The wheat was better than the first year, the soil having been rested properly, and the oat section exceeded every estimate they had made. Silas ran the reaper again with Pete Aldridge and 2 additional seasonal men they had brought in, and Lucy organized the whole operation from the edge of the field and the kitchen, and the accounts with the efficiency of someone who had been managing a ranch harvest since before she could have defined the word harvest, and the grain agent's figure at the end was the best the Double C had seen in 10 years. She was visibly pregnant during the weighing this time, which the grain agent Arthur Greer addressed by studiously focusing on his ledger and speaking to her with the same careful professionalism he had always shown, which she appreciated. Silas stood beside her during the weighing, his arm occasionally at her back, and when Greer gave the figure he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the satisfaction on his face mirrored the satisfaction in her chest in a way that felt like exactly what marriage was supposed to feel like. When Haggerty came by afterward, because he did, this time his tone was entirely different. He looked at the numbers she showed him and at her, and at the ranch around them with the expression of a man who has fully revised a prior assessment and is no longer uncomfortable with that revision. "Miss Covington," he said by habit, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Malone." "Both," she said pleasantly. "I kept my name as well, Sheriff. Lucy Covington Malone. It is on all the legal documents." He blinked once, but he recovered with more grace than she had expected. "Of course," he said. "Good harvest." "Very good harvest," she said. He rode away and she stood on the porch watching the dust settle, and Silas came up beside her and stood looking at the road. "You enjoy that," he said, not as a criticism. "I enjoy being right," she said. He said I could not manage it. "I have managed 2 harvests and an oat section, and I am currently also managing a child, which I expect will take considerably more management than the North Field, but I am approaching it with the same methodology." He put his arm around her shoulders, careful of her balance in her current state. "I have complete confidence in your methodology," he said. She leaned against him on the porch in the October afternoon with the harvested fields around them, and the ranch solid and real in hers, and she thought about all the mornings she had stood at the fence line taking measure of the land and the work ahead, and she thought about how the measure had changed, was larger now, encompassed more than the acreage and the grain, encompassed this man beside her, and the child coming, and the spring still to be planted, and the harvest still to be weighed, and she felt, as fully and as simply as she felt anything, that it was good. The child came in December on a night when the sky was clear, and the stars were the particular winter stars of the Texas panhandle, enormous and close and indifferent to anything as small as human happiness, and therefore a beautiful backdrop for it. It was a boy. He was born just after midnight with the help of Margaret Pruitt, who had been a midwife before she had been a store owner, and had delivered half the town of Red Rock Flats, including some of its current adults, and who managed the whole proceeding with the brisk expertise that Lucy deeply appreciated, and that Silas, who had stationed himself in the kitchen and been told firmly to stay there, found less soothing but tolerated. Lucy held her son in the gray light of early morning and felt the weight of him, specific and real and warm, and she thought this is what it is to love something that is entirely itself, and yet entirely yours. This is what her father had felt when he held her, and the thought moved through her with the mixed grief and wonder that had become the texture of her love for the people she had lost and the people she still had. Silas was brought in when Margaret Pruitt had declared everything satisfactory and tidied, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and Lucy put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time with the same controlled, careful wonder she had seen on his face in the kitchen in July. He looked at the baby and then at her with an expression so full of everything that words would have been a reduction of it. "Gerald," she said, "for my father, if you agree." He looked at the baby. "Gerald Malone." "Yes," he said, "I agree." They called him Gerald, and he was, from the first week, a child of remarkable opinions, loud about them in the way of newborns and later vocal in other ways as he grew into himself. He was healthy and serious, and looked like both of them in different lights, which Lucy thought was appropriate for a child born to two people who had managed to build something together without either of them becoming something other than what they were. The ranch grew through the years that followed with the patient organic growth of something healthy in good soil. The oat section became a permanent fixture of the operation and gave them a diversity of income that proved important during the 2 years in the mid-1880s when wheat prices softened across the whole region. Silas took on the management of the livestock with a focus and skill that complemented Lucy's talent for the grain operation, and they divided the work not by tradition but by aptitude, each taking the aspects of the ranch they were best suited to, and the arrangement worked because it was honest rather than assigned. Pete Aldridge eventually stayed on as a permanent hand, having decided that steady employment and decent wages, and a place he liked on a ranch run by people he respected, were preferable to the uncertain prospect of better wages elsewhere. And he turned out to be exactly the kind of long-term hand that made a ranch stable, reliable and invested and willing to bring problems to management before they became crises. Reuben Cole worked 2 more seasons and then retired to live with his sister in Lubbock, and Lucy paid him a bonus at the end of his last season without being asked, because the numbers supported it and because it was right. The Double C in 1885 was a different ranch than the Double C of 1882, not unrecognizably different but expanded and deepened, the way something grows that is being properly tended. The fences were sound. The barns were in good repair, the cattle herd had grown by careful managed expansion, and the fields yielded year over year with the consistency of land that is understood and respected. The ledgers were in order and the loan had long been paid, and there was a reserve that her father had never managed to build, because her father had always been one person doing the work of several, and she was not. She had Silas. He was not what she had expected, which was to say that she had not expected him at all, had not been looking for anyone when she stood at the fence line in September of 1882 and heard a horse on the road. She had been preparing to do everything herself, as she had always done everything, with competence and determination, and the plain understanding that the world was arranged in ways that required her to work twice as hard for the same result, and that this was simply the condition under which she operated. She had not been expecting to find a man who would not require her to do everything herself while simultaneously insisting that she could. And yet, in the evenings, when Gerald was in bed and the ranch was quiet and they sat together in the room where everything important happened, she thought that the shape of a life is not a thing you plan entirely in advance. You plan the harvest. You plan the planting. You plan the maintenance and the finances and the practical architecture of the thing. But the meaning of it, the weight and the warmth of it, arrives in the mornings and the evenings and the ordinary days, in a man who starts the coffee and brings a problem to the table as a partner and laughs genuinely at things that are genuinely funny. And she thought that this was the most important kind of abundance, the kind you tend carefully and that grows in proportion to the tending. In the spring of 1886, their daughter was born. Her name was Clara for Lucy's mother, and she arrived in May with the wheat just coming up and the oats showing their first green shoots along the creek, and she was, from the beginning, a child with opinions as loud as her brother's and a directness that Silas looked at and said, without surprise, "She is entirely you." "She is entirely herself," Lucy said, holding her daughter in the same morning light in which she had held her son, "as I am entirely myself, though I will accept the comparison." Gerald, who was 3½ and had been managing the information of a new sibling with the serious analytical approach he brought to all new information, came to the edge of the bed and looked at Clara with the focused appraisal of a very small person conducting an important assessment, and then he looked up at his mother and said, "She is very small." "You were smaller," Silas said. Gerald considered this for a moment, and then accepted it as factual and returned to examining his sister. "All right," he said, with the magnanimity of someone extending a hand to a valid competitor. Lucy looked at her children and her husband in the morning light of a May in the mid-1880s. In the house her father had built with his own hands from the limestone of the Texas panhandle, and she felt the full accumulated weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The grief, and the determination, and the harvest weighed and the loan paid, and the man on the roan horse who had stopped at her fence. And she felt it the way she felt the land under her feet when she walked the property in the early morning, solid and complex and entirely hers. Outside, the wheat was growing. The oats were growing. The cattle were in the south pasture in the May morning. Pete Aldridge was at the fence somewhere, doing the fencing work that the spring required, and the double C was running with the smoothness of something that has been built right and maintained with care. And everything that mattered was within these walls or visible through these windows, and it was enough, was more than enough, was the particular abundance that comes when a person knows what they have. Years later, when Gerald was old enough to understand the story and Clara was old enough to demand it be told again and again with no details omitted, Lucy told them about the September morning of 1882 when their grandfather had been buried, and the sheriff had stood at the grave and said she could not manage the ranch alone, and she had told him she could. And she had proven it in 23 days of harvest, and one strong set of numbers in an old ledger that still sat in the kitchen, because she had kept it, her father's handwriting and then hers in the same ruled columns. She told them about the man on the roan horse who had stopped at the fence line, because the wheat was ready, and she had needed an operator for a McCormick reaper, and life had aligned these two facts with the precision that life occasionally achieves when you are paying attention to it. She told them about the harvest and the grain agent, and the day Sheriff Haggerty had ridden out to see the figures, and she had shown them to him plainly and completely, and he had ridden back to town with the knowledge that she had been right and had said so, which was all she had asked. She told them about the ring in the coat pocket, and the dance at Christmas and the vows in the Hollies church, and all the springs and harvests that had followed, each one building on the last the way the soil of the double C built on itself year by year, deeper and richer and more productive because it was cared for properly. Gerald listened with the concentrated attention of a boy who would grow into a man like his father, steady and honest, and capable of the kind of patient love that does not seek to own the thing it loves. Clara listened with the particular intensity of a girl who was already, at 6 years old, walking the fence lines with her mother and learning to read the soil and the sky and the quality of the growing things, who would inherit not just the land but the understanding of how to tend it, as her mother had inherited it and her mother before her. Silas sat by the fire when Lucy told the story, not telling it himself but occasionally adding a detail when she paused, the color of the wheat that first morning, the way the reaper sounded on the north field, the particular expression on her face when the grain agent had given the figure and she had known it was good. He added these details the way he did everything, without taking over the story, completing it. The double C endured. The land endured because land endures when it is understood, when the person who holds the deed to it holds also the knowledge of its particular requirements and the commitment to meet them regardless of the season or the cost or the things that other people say a person of your kind cannot do. And the love endured, which is a less certain thing than land but equally real, built from the same materials as everything that lasts, work and honesty, and the daily choosing of each other in the ordinary mornings and the long evenings, and all the accumulated ordinary days that are the substance of a life. Lucy Covington Malone stood on the porch of her father's house on an October evening in 1887, the year Clara turned 1 and Gerald turned 4, and the harvest was the best the double C had ever recorded, and she looked at the land in the last of the light, and she felt what she always felt when she stood here, the weight and the rightness of it. The confirmation of the promise she had made at a graveside 5 years ago to a man in a pine box who had left her everything he had and believed she would know what to do with it. She heard the door open behind her, and Silas came out and stood beside her, his shoulder against hers, his eyes on the same last light she was watching. Inside the house she could hear Gerald's voice, high and confident, explaining something to Clara with the thoroughness of a boy who has inherited his mother's approach to information. "Good day," Silas said. "Very good day," she said. He took her hand and she let him, and they stood on the porch of the Double C as the last light went out of the Texas Panhandle sky, and the stars came up, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, above the harvested fields and the solid house and the full-root cellar and the sound of their children inside. And the world was exactly what it was, and it was enough, and it was theirs.